Finding your true colors.
We kind of want to remove the barriers of survival away from the community.
Is one step Amanda Ireland Esquivel says is crucial for someone recovering from drug or alcohol addiction.
What we want is for people to walk into the door, feel safe, feel like they don't have to explain who they are, and can really lean into focusing on what their recovery journey looks like.
6 months ago, True Colors Recovery in North Portland became the first dedicated recovery center for people who are queer or trans in Oregon, removing a barrier to recovery.
Do you think that survival is exaggerated or accentuated in the queer and trans community?
I think it's prevalent, yeah. I think that every one of us have had experience with having to walk into the room and assess whether we were safe to be ourselves or not.
For Amanda, she didn't feel the ability to be herself and come out until she was incarcerated at the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility in Wilsonville.
There's a lot of representation and normalcy with same-sex couples within the prison system. And so for me, surprisingly, prison was a place of safety for me to be my true self.
It was her time in prison that also started her path from addiction towards recovery. It wasn't the prison system that helped her, rather the network on the inside.
It was individuals that had a willingness and want to change that were role models for me.
It's important that as you are participating in your own treatment, you feel supported in that identity.
Mike Marshall leads Oregon Recovers, a coalition pushing for solutions to addiction in the state. He came to this role from a career in politics and a life fighting addiction to alcohol and other drugs. He's been in recovery for 15 years. Alcohol was around him at an early age, and now in his 60s, he was gay at a time when it wasn't safe to be out.
I think many people of my generation, their journey, their coming out process is, it was a lot easier to be open and honest when you were drunk. We were a highly traumatized community pre-AIDS crisis, right? Because we were raised to believe that we were flawed.
The gay rights movement started famously in a bar, the Stonewall Inn. In the 70s and before, those were the only places to be gay, be in drag, be lesbian, or be trans, and be safe. Then the AIDS crisis hit.
People didn't know if they were going to be alive the next year, and so boundaries were constantly being blown out. You have the huge trauma, whether you became HIV positive or not. Your roommate, your colleague, your boyfriend, your exes were dying during a period of time, and nobody seemed to care.
In the late 90s and early 2000s, Mike was living in California, working in politics and on campaigns that were the early sparks of the marriage equality movement. At the same time, drugs associated with dance parties and nights out were becoming more common in his life. Eventually, they became his life.
I started using meth in 1998, and it was a 10-year trajectory downwards.
Mike hit his deepest point when a close friend died of AIDS. With everything falling apart around him, another friend took him to the hospital to get clean.
I woke up one morning and I was broke, I was unemployable, I was 3 months behind on my rent. The intake nurse was 10 years in recovery, and she made me sit in her office all day long that first day, and I just sat and cried. I get emotional just thinking about it.
One friend covered Mike's rent. Another put up $15,000 so he could go into treatment, a privilege Mike knows few people have. At the same time he was facing his addiction, he was facing discrimination as well.
I went to one where the guy leading the meeting was just making homophobic remarks. And I was the only queer person in my treatment class at that point. And part of me wanted to get up and walk out. And if I'd been 26, that's exactly what I would have done. But again, the system isn't designed for us to succeed.
We don't just get abused by everything around us. When we get told a negative message over and over, we take that message in and we start beating ourselves up with it. And I think for the LGBT community especially, we're really good at that.
The National Institute for Health reports that 39% of LGBTQ plus people will struggle with addiction. For heterosexual people, it's 17%. Gifford says it's likely substance abuse rates have increased since the pandemic.
Where do you think that disproportionate nature comes from?
It's painful. Not only are you dealing with your own coming out process and your own internal possible homophobia or whatever phobia you're dealing with, but you're also dealing with a community that's resonating with that negative message and giving you that message in 100 different ways.
It's less about some sensationalized inherent part of being queer, trans, intersex, asexual, two-spirit individual, that makes addiction more common or pervasive. It's about the cultural conditions that we live within.
The website translegislation.org reports in 2015 there were 15 bills introduced targeting drag shows, transgender healthcare, access to bathrooms or sports, and other anti-queer or anti-trans actions. So far in 2023, there have been 494 bills introduced just this year.
The message that sends to people is that it's not safe to be yourself, that you don't matter, that you're less than human. The queer and trans hostility in this country and the racial hostility in this country exacerbates the issue of substance use issues because accessing care is that much more difficult.
Amelia was brought into the Equi Institute as a recovery mentor to help people who have gone through treatment. Her position was made possible by funding from Measure 110, the voter-approved law that spends marijuana tax money on recovery services and decriminalize small amounts of drugs. Treatment and recovery spaces, like True Colors, are a step towards easing the path to finding specific addiction care for queer and trans people. But True Colors is the only facility of its kind in Oregon. The NIH reports just 7% of treatment and recovery centers have specialized programs for queer and trans people. In response, Serenity Lane has been stepping up its efforts, adding diversity, equity, and inclusivity standards and trainings in order to treat addiction more effectively.
And what does that say about the recovery environment for queer and trans people that several organizations are really just starting to recognize that these affirming spaces are needed?
Well, the message is getting out, right?
Being able to have sober spaces where people can access and then not jeopardize their recovery is essential.
Amanda says 500 people each month are coming through True Colors doors. With just 6 months since the grand opening, it's a foundation she believes they can build upon.
It feels good. You always have that fear where you're going to open the door and then nobody's going to show up, or you might have overestimated the need. And then being able to see a response that's so welcoming from the community is very affirming.